Good evening. I know it's always so hard to get people settled down. It's so exciting, right? It's great. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us, both here in the room in person and also by Zoom. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C., which I now have to say because we have people on Zoom from all over. It's great. My pronouns are she and her. And as we begin, I always like to acknowledge the Nacotchtank, who are also documented as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey. And these are the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. We are so pleased to have audiences joining us for tonight's program. And for those of you in the theater, I think you know what the first thing I'm going to tell you to do. Make sure your devices are turned off so our speakers don't hear, the barks and the chirps and the, right. But for those of you who are joining us by Zoom, please make yourselves comfortable because your microphones and cameras are off. But you may submit any questions that you have via the Q&A function in the Zoom module whenever they cross your mind. And we will get to questions both here in the room and on Zoom at the end of the program. And for those of you who are in the theater, please wait for the microphone to come to you before you ask your question so that the people on Zoom can hear it. As many of you know, this weekend on Saturday, February 17th, our new exhibition, Marjorie Merriweather Post's Paris, will open, and that will allow you to experience the City of Light through Post's eyes. It is a gorgeous exhibition that you do not want to miss. Our month-long Great Homes and Gardens series continues with tonight's lecture. And then be sure to come back next Thursday night, February 22nd, for a conversation with Janine Hayes, Brian Mason, and myself to discuss their fascinating and important book, Afro Chic. And then again on February 27th to hear from Victoria Kastner. She is presenting her book about the life of the trailblazing architect Julia Morgan, and she is most famous for having designed Hearst Castle. Tonight, we're excited to hear from Marta McDowell and Larry Lederman with a deep dive into their book, DuPont Gardens of the Brandywine Valley. Please join us for a book signing after the lecture, and the book signing, of course, is right outside the doors here. Of course, books are available for purchase in the museum shop. So, before we begin, let me introduce our speakers. Following a successful career in corporate law, Larry Lederman turned to photography as an avocation. From an initial focus on the forms and foliage of trees, Lederman now captures the beauty of gardens and landscapes through the seasons. He's the author of many books, including Magnificent Trees of the New York Botanic Gardens, the Rockefeller Family Gardens, An American Legacy, and Garden Portraits, Experiencing Natural Beauty, all published by Monticelli, and he is the principal photographer for the 125th anniversary edition of the New York Botanical Garden. Marta McDowell is a garden historian and writer, whose books include Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, Unearthing the Secret Garden, and Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life. She teaches landscape history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden and is a featured speaker at garden clubs and horticultural organizations. They will take turns at the podium this evening. Now, please join me in welcoming Marta and Larry.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all here and, wherever you are on Zoom for joining us this evening. So, this is a story of a family, the DuPonts, and 5 of their gardens that are all in very close proximity to one another in the general area around Wilmington, Delaware. So, we'll start on January 1st, 1800, a long way back, and not on the land, but on the sea. The members of the DuPont family arrived on the American Eagle, just off the coast of Newport, Rhode Island, is where it, put in anchor. And it really didn't take very long for the de facto head of the family to find a place for them to settle. So the DuPonts were coming from France. They were immigrants. And they settled along the Brandywine. The Brandywine is about a 60-mile waterway. It rises in Chester County, Pennsylvania. But the most important part for Eleuther Irénée DuPont, or EI, as I'll call him from now on, was the fact that the water moved. Now, those of you who are on the, in the DC area are familiar with the Great Falls of the Potomac. This was on the fall line, so it was perfect for mills. And that's what he had in mind for the family business. So he starts building millworks for the creation, manufacture of black powder, and the water really does move. Now, if you visit, it seems very calm, but Larry got this shot at high water, and so you can really see the power of the water. In fact, this got to be a dangerous flood. At the time. But the family prospered and the business prospered. And that is what really funded the garden development over several generations of DuPonts. So this first DuPont, E.I. DuPont, by 1803, he has built himself a house, which was just the central portion of this. Again, you see very Georgian house. It feels very right down here in our nation's capital. And what I found in looking at the garden history of these gardens was that it really, if you look across them, it encapsulates the design ideas that were coming into America, mostly from Europe, is where they were borrowing them. And so we'll start out with the idea of French, right? These were French people settling here in America. They transplanted themselves, if you will. But for a long time, actually, even in the factory, they spoke French. They, of course, wanted a potager. So E.I. DuPont builds a house. He's got, the family moves in 1803. Some of his, brothers and cousins have other houses on this extensive property. But he wants a garden, a potager, right? So within the next year, he's getting shipments of things like lavender roots and tree stock from France so that he can have his French garden here. And so again, it's very much a French-style garden and is maintained that or restored that way. You can see the espalier along the fence, and then these trees on the right are very carefully pruned in a style. I loved this term, so I have to share it with you. It's called en canoia. Canoia, it's like a spindle, and so when they're all pruned out, you can really see they're very much in a spindle shape over here on the right. Here is a plan that one of the granddaughters of E.I. DuPont drew. So this is a little later, but she tried to capture the plan of the old garden. And so you can see that geometry that was very favored in French gardens. We had a chance to tour the gardens briefly here at Hillwood, and I think Marjorie Merriweather Post would have approved of this as well. It certainly had some roses mixed in there with the vegetables, but it's very much was a productive garden and still is. Now, there is a grander version of the French style represented in these 5 gardens that Larry chose. So this is Nemours, and I will confess that before this project, I had not visited this garden. I knew of Nemours as a children's hospital, and it's the same family who endowed the hospital, and their estate is right next door. But it is also open to the public. You can see this wonderful alley of trees going up. And at the time when they would open the gardens, which they did sometimes for charity, even when it was their home, one of the local papers called the outing "A Day in Old France." Now, it was quite the representation of old France, as you can see from this aerial shot. But Alfred I. DuPont, who again would have been a grandson of E.I. DuPont, of the first DuPont, was really building this in homage to his ancestors, but also as a love letter to his first wife, who was quite smitten with all things French. So isn't that lovely? So the architect was Thomas Hastings, one of the very famous pair, Career and Hastings, from New York. And I love what he once wrote of these grand, sort of country place mansions. He said, if the house is the main course, then the garden is the sauce. And so you can see this had quite the sauce, and it was built around 1910. So again, quite spectacular. This wonderful long view, this real axis. I was just telling my landscape history students, teaching them about the French symmetry going straight up to this grand sort of French revival style mansion. Now, we are going to move from French in this kind of Baroque style back to Renaissance Italy. Now, some of you may recognize this garden. It's a famous Italian garden called the Villa Gambaraia. It is a hill garden that is outside of Florence. It is an old 16th century garden. It did have some substantial changes in the very early 20th century, including the addition of those 4 water pools, even though the garden is from the Renaissance period. But this garden was visited by Pierre Samuel DuPont, another grandson, a cousin of Alfred, right? This is, still all in the family. And he decides he wants one of those. So he comes back to his property, which was called Longwood, right? Many of you familiar with Longwood Garden. Now, Pierre Samuel bought Longwood in 1906 because he wanted to preserve the trees. It had a very old collection of trees called Pierce's Woods. And in fact, when Wilfred told us about this garden, he said the Pierce family was very involved in Rock Creek Park. It made me wonder if it's the same Pierces. But anyway, I don't know about that. But I know the Pierce family made this grand collection of trees. It was in danger of being cut down, for money. And Pierre comes in and buys the property and decides, this would be a nice weekend place, right? He was running DuPont. He's living in Wilmington. And Longwood Gardens is probably, 10 or 12 miles from downtown Wilmington. So anyway, he starts to play, and he had the money to do it. So let's have an Italian water garden, very much like the Villa Gambaraia. And then he goes and visits another garden called the Villa Gori in Siena. It had an outdoor theater. So Pierre said, gee, we want one of those. And we're going to do one better. We're going to have an outdoor theater with fountains. And so when this garden opens in 1914, he invites a bunch of his friends. And the News Journal of Wilmington puts in an article about its debut. Here's what they write. Just at dark, electric lights were turned on, simultaneously illuminating the stage. So they had this program of costume dances and then this big finale. and I quote, "A frolic by the Harlequins who, much to the surprise of the guests, danced among them, throwing confetti and garden roses, then winding their way out in a path of light, finally disappearing amongst the trees." That was in 1914. Now, Pierre knew how to throw a party. That's what I said. Did he know Marjorie Merriweather Post? I think they would have liked one another. So, he didn't stop there. He had this big space and really, endless funds. So even though he is working, madly on not only DuPont, but, he runs General Motors for a while, he decides, I'm going to keep going. And he loved hydraulics. Remember, he was an engineer. So he decides, look, we're going to just go over the top. So this is the main Fountain Plaza. Yes, I think this outdoes the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, right? This was opened in 1931. Just to put our minds like where we are, this is 2 decades before Disneyland opens, right? This is huge. And he does this, again, kind of for his friends. Again, the Philadelphia Inquirer said, this is a fairyland of lights come alive. Because even in the 1930s, this was all lit. These were illuminated fountains. Now, I will say, since then, they've been changed out. It's all LED lighting. It is all computerized. You can go hear these amazing sort of music and light shows. And it really is still quite spectacular. So these are all sort of Italianate gardens, if you will. And I'm going to move to a different style of Italian and go back to that original home that E.I. DuPont built. And now his granddaughter, who is Louise Crowninshield, married name, so Louise DuPont Crowninshield, with her husband. Let's see, she sort of acquires Eleutherian Mills. Actually, her father buys it for her. So it was nice, because he wanted a place where she would come visit him. So that was very nice. And so the old house is up here. Let's see if I can get this pointer working. Can I get it? There we go. There's the old house, right, that we saw, that little, quote, brick house it's on the top of the hill. It was built to look down onto the mill works, right? So the original DuPonts were looking down onto the powder mill. So the house now looks at the ruins of the powder mill, because the DuPonts have decided, no, we're going to move it to a different location. They did have some explosions there over the years. No, it is true. And Louise and her husband, Francis, and Francis was very involved in this, decide they're going to make a ruin garden. So this is now much more kind of arts and crafts era, right? This idea that it's going to look almost like an uncovered Pompeii. So they build their garden on the remnants of the old powder works. And it is, this painting of it, it looks absolutely spectacular. Now, it still has a magic, but I will say this is a garden that needs somebody to give them a bucket of money. This is speaking personally. I have no connection with what's now called Hagley, the old Eleutherian Mills. But it is this magical place that Larry has captured in his pictures. And you can see they brought in columns. They traveled a lot. So, they'd come back from Italy and, they'd say, oh, well, this looks nice. This is sort of some remnant of some church in Rome. So they would have their local craftsmen build them one, right? So they didn't import pieces of it. Like Hearst Castle and other places. But, it has this wonderful charm. Just as Winter Tour does. I think they really captured this in the more recent garden. This is the Enchanted Garden, where they've used old bits of the old Winter Tour estate to create a children's garden. It's a little hard to tell because there are no people in this picture, but the chairs are very small scale. So they're really for little people. And so, again, it gives that sort of arts and crafts feeling. Now, of course, we have the English landscape style. And when I go around these DuPont gardens, I think of Capability Brown. I love that name, right? Capability Brown. He's in the 1700s in England. And if he comes to visit your estate, he will say to you, well, this property has great capabilities. Meaning, if you just have like enough money in those pockets, I can make it look like this, like everyone's image of what England should be. Well, here it is in the Brandywine Valley, again, at Winter Tour, looking at one of these marvelous views. This, again, very Capability Brown. This is at Nemours, where you've got these managed water courses. Just like Pierre loved water, so did Alfred. Alfred was another engineer, right? They sent a lot of the young men, the young DuPonts, to MIT. So these are all created water courses. There's a whole pumping system that Alfred created for Nemours to run these artificial streams. Just beautiful. Even cascades. This is one at Longwood that Pierre Samuel DuPont said, well, if we're going to have this big fountain terrace, we might as well have a cascade too. Again, if you go around these old English estate gardens, there are lots of Capability Brown cascades. Now at Longwood, we saw a lot of fountains. We haven't seen a lot of flowers yet, but this is actually Pierre's first drawing for his very first garden, which was his flower walk. You can see it's a very simple plan. It's this sort of crochet plan and full of flowers at any season. And again, aren't these lovely? Love that, Larry. This is the flower garden at Nemours called the Four Borders Garden in the spring, as you can tell, with this glory of peonies and Japanese irises. And here at Mount Cuba, and we haven't talked about Mount Cuba yet, but this is the garden of a great grandson, Lamont DuPont Copeland, and his wife Pamela, and they hired Marion Coffin to design this perennial garden near their colonial revival house. It has since been replanted with natives of the area, native plants of the area, and we'll come back to that in just a second. This is Winter Tour. I was talking about Marion Coffin, the landscape architect. She worked with the Copelands, but she first worked with Henry Francis DuPont at Winter Tour. Henry Francis DuPont, he inherits the estate from his father in 1928. He writes to Marion Coffin, I need your help on, redoing the garden, because he was adding a little addition to the house, a 9-story addition to hold his collections of American antiques and works of art. And, he said, I want the garden finished as soon as we finish the house, which was a joke because he worked on it for the rest of his life. But she designed this wonderful formal area near the house going down to what then was the family swimming pool. So almost all the DuPonts, I think all the gardens had a swimming pool, and they used them. These were family homes. This was the swimming pool. And then, look at the azaleas, the hydrangeas, the dogwoods. That was really Henry Francis. He was the plantsman. She did all of the plans, but he did the planting. He studied at Harvard. He studied plantings. This is an old picture from the Smithsonian, the Archives of American Gardens, of a planting at Winter Tour, probably from the 1940s or 50s. And there's one of Larry's. Those spectacular azalea woods are all an accident of, well, not exactly nature. It was the chestnut blight. It took out all the chestnuts out of the woodlands. And so he decided this is an opportunity. It opens up the canopy. I'll plant azaleas. And Larry and I were just talking on the way down here on the train. Henry Francis DuPont, he, of course, had a huge staff of gardeners. But he was very particular about color, both inside the house and outdoors. And he would go around. If he wasn't satisfied with the way a certain area looked, he would tag the azaleas so that he could have his gardeners lift them and move them. This doesn't look nice next to that. It's not bad. The quarry garden, which Larry will talk more about later, also at Winter Tour. And I just want to return to Mount Cuba. We're almost at the end, and I'll pass it over to Larry. Mount Cuba started as open cornfields, right? They plant the house in the middle, right? It was all open. You know, you could just look out and you go, there's nothing there. Again, they hire a Marion Coffin and they start to plant and they start to work down not just the house and that formal perennial garden, but they start to work down the hill, down the west slope, and start to plant it in a naturalistic way. Again, this is very kind of end of the 19th, early 20th century William Robinson, The Wild Garden. And before too long, they decide to switch their focus to natives of the Piedmont. And so you see this wonderful planting of Tiarella. Mount Cuba is beautiful at every season. You'll see different seasons in Larry's, but in the spring, it's just amazing. Again, this is down that west slope walk. They started this focus on native plants in the 1960s. You know, this is before Earth Day. This is way, way early. So, you know, you go, kids. This is great. And I'll just close here. I just think it's such a beautiful image of Winter Tour, you know, looking off on this wonderful landscape. And with that, I will hand it off to Larry with just one thing to keep in mind. Hang on, that in this area, it's about 10 square miles, the DuPonts and their public gardens and land preservation, all connected to this family, have preserved almost 4,000 acres of land. So it's really quite amazing. So Larry, thank you.
Marta's a tough act to follow. What we're going to do is I'm going to try to be linear about dealing with each of the gardens separately. The cover, though, is of Winter Tour, and we chose the cover because it's not like the cover of any garden book. Usually there's a path, there's a door, or some sense of entry into the garden. Here, what you have is you have a woodland, and this is what defines the difference of these gardens. They're all unique, and together, by the way, they are about 5 square miles. It's hard to believe. And if you're a New Yorker or know anything about New York, I tell people that at least 3 or 4 of the gardens are larger than Central Park and the New York Botanical Garden put together. So just think about that. Now, what I did was I undertook to do the photographs over about a year and a half. I usually like to start in the winter. I got a tour of your gardens, which is perfect in the winter. I get to see all the bones and understand it and get a feel for it. And it's gorgeous. I want you to know that. But I started in the winter, and what I did was I did 2 springs, because I said these are really spring gardens in a way. It's very difficult in the first spring to fully appreciate it, and you have to really do 2 springs. And I went down. This is a picture of a Winter Tour, and it's the house. The house is huge. I've caught it in a way to give it a sense of its immersion in the garden itself. That which is the way Henry would have looked at it. But I went down every 2 weeks, and I spent 3 days photographing. So, and I just went and I did all those visits, and I wound up with an enormous number of photographs, and we put together the book. And this is the first time the family has ever worked together. There was some falling out, and when I got a call from a lawyer in Wilmington. He said, "Can you do 2 or 3 of the gardens?" I said, "I'll do 5." He says, "They don't talk to each other." let me see what I can do. And he came back. I said, I'm not going to do them unless I can do 5. He said, okay. He came back. He said, I have 5. Can you get a publisher? So it took him a week to get the permission. It took me a week to get a publisher. Okay. This is the Glade Garden designed by Marion Coffin. They were actually classmates at Harvard. She was in the horticultural program. He was in the program animal husbandry, I think, is what he did. He had they all have barns. He had animals. He had prize cows and so forth. So you can see that it's beautifully wrought and it's complex. This is the entryway to the quarry garden, and Henry couldn't stop planting, no matter where he was. And you'll see this because one of the gardens, there was a tennis court and he ripped it out because he needed more planting area. So this is the entryway down to the quarry, and this is the quarry. This garden, a winter tour in the spring, is gorgeous. It is full of surprises. The quarry, you can walk down into it, and there are steps, and you walk around it, and you can just see how lush and brilliant it is. You can get an overview up there, but you really have to come down into the garden to experience it. Now, a river runs through it. They're all really benefit from water, and this is the Clenny Run, which is a Brandywine tributary. And you can see how lushly planted the run is. It's right near the house. The one interesting thing, which you may have seen from some of the photographs, are that there are gazebos and other kinds of objects throughout the garden. It is really a woodland garden, but it has long landscapes, long views, and so forth. You can get lost in it. But these kinds of gazebos set points in the horizon so that you can not get lost and you can sort of know where you are. And we'll see that here in the next slide. This is the sundial garden, which used to be the tennis court. And in the background, you see that gazebo. So one of the things I do in my photographs is I try to give you, when you go through the book, a sense of place, but the garden does that as well. It's hard to get lost in these gardens as large as they are. This is the March Bank. The real glory of the woodland garden at Winter Tour is the March Bank. It just breaks out with enormous vigor early March, mid-March, and the woodlands are just covered with ephemerals, and they're just beautiful. He planted thousands upon thousands of them, and these are popular trees. They're huge, and you can just see the yin and the yang of it. We now move to Nemours, which is a French garden. It's completely different. It has its own natural aspects, but the central theme is control. And so this is a photograph of the bays, which is part of the long walk. When you walk on the long walk, you have, which is practically like 3 or 4 football fields. So it's really huge. And but as you go down it, you have surprises. You enter various kinds of different rooms, in effect. And a certain part of it, there's the fountain behind, but this is a maze. It's just to distract you give you a sense of playfulness and the sense of wonder and mystery that the walk entails. This is the long walk in the winter. It's addressed for Christmas decor, and that is the colonnade, which is part of it. On the long walk, you have various areas which diverge, and you walk over this bridge, which is called the Humpback Bridge. It's quite beautiful in the spring, and you can see that it's a very novel shape. These are horse chestnut trees. I took the shot from this end, and I just love the way the trees sweep down, and you get to, in the background, you see the Temple of Love, which is the end point of the long walk. There are a lot of water features here, and these are full foliage on the long walkway where the alley is pictured. There's an alley, you'll see it. You saw it in one of Marta's pictures. I had the alley in the fall. I'll show it to you. This is the sunken garden, which is part of the walk and the colonnade, and it's Carrara marble for the sculptures. It's hard to believe, really. That's the long walk. That's the LA. It borders the long walk, and it took me till the fall to get what I was waiting for. I knew that they're maple trees, and I knew they would show with real color. And I kept waiting for it, and I got called. They said, "They're ready. They're ready. Come on, come on." People were rooting for me. And this gives you a sense of the complexity. This is an area which is called the Garden of Asian Influence, and the trees are magnolias. They're not flowering now, but when they flower, they're absolutely wonderful. Now, we get into Longwood here, and which is characteristic of the way I photograph. I never show you a building, straight up. I have it pictured through the trees and the way the trees are such that the branches have a shape to them and so forth. So I give you a sense of place. I try to give you a sense of depth so that there's always a foreground, there's a middle ground, and then there's a distance so that you can see through and you get a sense of the depth of the garden. Longwood is a show place, okay? This is one of the first pictures I took, and the reason why I did, I would never go inside to start, but I got there, it was raining. That's the photographer's lot, When I photographed the Rockefellers, on the first day it was raining, and I sat under a tree and waited for the rain to stop, and I looked around, and there was sculpture all over the place, and I said, there's a mind at work. So sometimes just sitting still or having rain opens up the world for you. But this is quite beautiful. It's a display, and the ground is wet so that the marble will reflect. Longwood has the most variety. It's really a show place. And so you have the plantings here, and you have the topiary, which are sheared yews. This is their mixed border, but it's nice to see them integrated in a way. These are American pillar rambling roses. So Longwood has everything, and flowers, and flowers. I try to shoot it so that you could have a sense of the depth of it. And after a week or two, when these are gone, the next day, they're planted again. So there's a kind of a difference because the greenhouses are heavily used here, and they have more glass houses than you can imagine. It's an enormous engine to keep that garden going. Here it is again. I like to show this photograph because it reads almost as black and white, and it shows the elegance of the fountains. In color, when they have the lights, you don't have the same sense of elegance, but it's brilliant. And what's interesting is what you can capture. I love the fact that you can get the lacy effect of the water, so that usually it's blurred, but this really came out beautifully. Took a lot of photographs to get something like this. This is the back end of the Italian garden. It's a view that most people don't get because people are usually standing above. You're allowed to walk in that garden, but people never walk through and get to the other side. So one of the things I always do is I make sure that in the book I give you views that no one goes to or sees. And this again, this is part of Pierce's Woods. When they first bought the property, these are Atlas cedars. I love trees. I love to photograph trees. And you can see how they integrate with each other, how they overlap, how they're symbiotic and depend on each other. And they show enormous power and beauty. This is their meadow. They have a huge meadow. And I had a house on the property. It was student housing. So what I was told was, it's not much, but it has $1 million view. My wife said, when I went down there, I was down there, she said, "You're living like an assassin." So, so I said, that's true, but I said, when I get a sky like that and I have a little wine by myself, I gave it up to walk down and take the photograph. This is the Webb house, and this dates back to the 18th century. Now, this is Hagley. This is the family seat. This is the first house. It was expanded a little, and there is the business office. They built a barn out of stone, and this is a true American story, because when they got there was nothing. And they built the barn first, and they lived in the barn with the animals. That's how they started, and they wound up with the DuPont company also owning General Motors, and they had to divest of General Motors. So it shows you from humble beginnings. This is also a very interesting 20th century story. This alley is quite beautiful, but what happened was, it was the entrance to the house. But come the 20th century with the automobile, the lights drove everybody nuts, and so they changed the pathway to the house, and this is no longer a pathway. Just tells you, even when you have something serene and beautiful and so forth, time and chance happeneth. These are pictures of the old powder works, and you can see how they carted. They had a railway right through the property. In fact, there's a couple of the properties were connected by the railway because Henry had his animals. He would have them transported by rail. This gives you a sense. Those houses were built. This is where they stored the powder, and they were built without windows on this side, and no windows on the other, but they faced basically the water. So if they blew up on the water side, and they did blow up from time to time. So now this is a sense of the ruin, and what's wonderful about the ruin is, first day I got there, it was raining, of course, but it was a very, very light rain, and I could photograph. And people said, "Oh, it's so bad. The light's not very good." I said, "No, no, this is perfect light for a ruin. You know, you get the mystery of it." And those cauldrons were used to make powder, and so they integrated both the Roman ruin with the family business, and so it's more than just a copy. It's basically, it was very thoughtful. There's a mosaic, and now Marta's absolutely right. This should come back. I don't think it has to be brought back to where it was in the painting, but it would be wonderful if people could walk through and just get the sense of the mystery of it. And again, they used to have over this bridge. They would have where they diverted the water for their powder mills and so forth. They had part of this garden which was shown in the painting. Again, this is all part of it. You can see how complex the works were. Now we're at Mount Cuba. This is the gate, and of course they had the eagles because the family came over with the eagle. This gate is that's a weeping cherry. It was built by the Copelands. The Copelands are a later generation. Mr. Copeland was the last of the DuPonts to run the DuPont company. So it's a later generation. And Martha went through the borders with you with all native plantings now. This is Marion Coffin's design. It's in the round garden. So Marion Coffin not only worked for Henry, but she worked for the Copelands as well. She's quite brilliant. And she had a huge practice, really. This is a view of the round garden over the muley grass, which I just love. It's fall, and these grasses become white, and they're quite spectacular. This is pond with water lilies, and the trees look. They have the arches. They have a cathedral look. They're poplars, and they grow straight up. They were used in the 19th century to make the masts for sailing ships. Here they are. This is the meadow at Mount Cuba. This is known as the zigzag pond. It's man-made, but it's one of the most beautiful. It's most beautiful of the ponds in all the gardens. Each of these gardens is magnificent, but each has its own features which make it different from the others. So this has a woodland effect. And this is the end of the story, and we'll take questions. Okay.
I will get us started with a question from Zoom. Someone is interested to know if either of you have advice for those interested in visiting the gardens in the spring. Any particular timings or best ways to visit?
So the question was, is there any advice we might give people for timing a visit in spring?
Okay. Well, first I would say the following. You can't do it one day. Okay? So you have to do it on a weekend, and you have to divide it up. You can, in the early spring, you can get to basically Longwood is terrific. And in the early spring, Longwood will have a display, a real display.
Yes.
Winter is gorgeous in early spring.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so is Mount Cuba. So, here's the difficulty. You could go for a long weekend and do a garden a day. You will be exhausted, right? Because you could spend a week in each of these gardens. But I think that I would say the top 3 in spring would be Mount Cuba, Winter Tour, and Longwood. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Hagley you can do later on because you need to have the trees in leaf and so forth. Yes. And same thing for Nemours.
Nemours.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. I would say concentrate on those 3. I will have to put in a plug for Hagley, though, because that and Nemours were the 2 that I had not seen before Larry so kindly invited me into his project. And they were both wonderful surprises to me. Nemours, because it's a very grand garden and grand, collection inside. You'll find similarities to Hillwood and Marjorie Merriweather Post's collections. And Hagley because of the industrial history and the connection, and it's really well curated for that. I will say at Hagley, the gardens, they'll say, oh yeah, and there are the gardens. The gardens are wonderful, but you kind of have to seek them out on your own.
I would say the following, and this is not meant to be a plug for the book, but
Yes, it is.
okay. But before you go, look at the book. After you go, look at the book. For the following reason. It will get you to know what you would like to see, okay, as a guide. When you get there, it will look different, okay? And then when you'll try to find what I've done, but I'm standing in places you wouldn't stand and so forth, which is meant to give you a sense of the place in another way. And then when you finish, go back to the book and see if you can integrate what you saw with what the vision is. And so I think with any gardens, if there's a book, okay?
Yeah, there you go. I think there was one in the back, and we'll come back up here.
At the beginning, there was a lot of talk about Pierce. And you mentioned that Pierce was involved in Rock Creek Park as well. And driving here, crossing Beach Drive, you pass the Pierce Mill and the Pierce Mill Barn. Is that the same Pierce?
So that was my question as well. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. So I only heard today about Pierce of Rock Creek Park and Pierce's Mill. And so I don't know. In fact, I don't know if it was even the same spelling, but
Well, I doubt it's the same one for the following reason. That the land was being sold. They had run it for 200 years. They had owned the property.
Yeah.
And the land was being sold, and they wouldn't have sold it if they were a wealthy family.
Yeah.
So, and he bought it to save
Yeah.
the trees. So just that, based on my estimate of the various pocketbooks.
Yeah. So if the Pierce down here was a Quaker, then there's a strong possibility they might be in the same family, because I know the ones in Delaware it was a Quaker family and they were interested in trees.
Do any part of the DuPont
Okay, so the question for those of you on Zoom is, do any part of the DuPont family still live on the estates? And I think the answer is no.
No, these are all in trusts
Right.
now. The DuPont families are involved in all the trusts. They're on all the boards, various members, and so forth. And the families get together. And what was really interesting was I photographed Nemours with when there was no one there. I went on days when it was closed. I went on days when no one was around because it was the winter and so forth. And when I went down, when we had the book, launched the book, we had a party on the back of the house with the long walk and so forth. And there were people, and we had old cars that they had antique cars that drove you to the house.
It was swell.
So when I had the sense then, when we were all out there with holding our drinks, that I was in the 30s, and I had the sense that this place really did have an effect on people, and that people mattered to the place, you know. So, and in a way, seeing it without all these people and just visiting, you can't have the sense of what it is to have people around on a summer night just enjoying themselves.
You bet. Question here.
Who doesn't speak to whom?
All right, what happened was, Alfred was supposed to be, they were buying the business, Alfred was supposed to be the chairman. And what happened was the cousins got together, and he went on the outs, and Pierre ran it. And he was the better businessman, by the way. He was a brilliant businessman.
So Alfred, you know, there's also, like any family, there's a certain level of family dirt, which we don't really get into in the book. But Alfred got divorced. And remember, this is a traditional Catholic family, and it was back in the day when, you know, they were conservative, and they looked down on this, and they really had a problem with Alfred's divorce. And so that caused a big tear in the family. And should I tell them the story about the wall? So there's this story, and you know,
Yes.
it might be apocryphal, but there's this story. Nemours was completely walled, and on the top of the wall, he had his workmen use broken glass bottles. And the story, which could be completely not true, was that was to keep the family out. You know, to keep the rest of the family out. So don't quote me on that.
The quote was, "Everybody's invited, except the DuPonts."
Could I ask a question, Marta? Speaking of DuPonts, back to EI, when he came 1802, was the French Revolution a reason why the family left?
Yeah, they were kind of supporting the king. You know, they were trying to skate sort of in the middle, and it did. So they decided to scoot. You know, his father was ennobled, and you know, he was just kind of on the cusp. He was sort of, with the king, not with the king. And I think they decided, you know, we've got some funds. We've got some wealthy friends who will help by giving us also some, you know, sort of some starter money. And so they had money to begin with. You know, they weren't coming in to try to, you know, to be, you know, dirt farmers or anything. They had a nest egg to get these manufacturing started. And EI had some training in manufacturing powder.
The French were known for their ability to manufacture powder, and I think Jefferson told EI that they should go into the business.
Yeah, because they
Because
were all
Americans-
complaining
yeah.
about the gunpowder that was available in America at the time. So
Well, it's also used for roads and building and so forth.
Yeah, and I will tell you all, there is a pamphlet called Farming with Dynamite put out by the DuPont Corporation. And that wonderful alley of trees at Nemours that you saw in 2 seasons in Larry's photos, the trees died a couple times because of bad drainage. And evidently Alfred blew out all the holes with dynamite to So that's a different way of gardening.
I'm going to jump in with another question from Zoom. Could you talk a little bit about your process of working together on the book, about how you decided which images to use and how to craft the text?
Okay, so I think the question, Katie, tell me if I've gotten it, is how did we work together on the book, choosing images and the text? So you want to start with the image selection?
Okay. Well, I started by photographing. That's how we started. And I produced a range of photographs so that I could show it to the editor and we could show it to Marta. And so she had a sense of what she was going to see, and I kept producing. But ultimately, and then when we would also feed her more information and more photographs. But she had approach of doing the history of the gardens, which she did separately, and so forth. But we ultimately we got together and we looked at all our photographs and we read all the text, and then we brought it together. But it takes a lot of doing, and the problem is that there were so many photographs. You have to understand that and there's a reason why there are a lot of photographs. First of all, it's now inexpensive to take a lot of photographs. At one point, it was very expensive to take color photographs. The other thing is that you have to make a decision as a photographer whether the computer is going to be the basis for how you present your work, or the camera is going to be the basis. So, and my view is the camera. So what I do is I take 3, 4, or 5 pictures of this in different speeds, which is different light. And so, and then I choose from the 5 the one that is the best. And because everything changes, even if you do it all within 60 seconds, the sun has come out, the sun has gone in, the leaves have moved, it's all kinds of things are happening. There are people who take pictures and they put them together. But you can't do that when you're doing landscapes, because every picture is different.
May I interject?
Yeah.
So, to tell you about the text. Now, I got a call from an editor, Larry, who's done books for the New York Botanical Garden, is doing this book about the DuPont Gardens. This really interests me. And I think that Elizabeth said, we'll want an essay about each garden. And I think she said 2,000 words. Maybe she said 3,000 words per garden. Now, these gardens, they're enormous. Their history is long. You could write whole books, and they've been written, about each of these gardens. So my problem was not only the volume of history, but then, I'd start looking at the historic images, and then Larry, I'd get like, bloop, here comes more pictures from Larry. And I'd open this up, and there'd be like, here's like another 300 of them. It's like, so the problem was one of richness of topic and trying to find the thread that would join the history with these wonderful images and try to convey enough in a few words. So that was,
Martha
it was
did
fun.
a wonderful job, I must say that.
It was fun.
Really, it made the whole thing rich, and it made it alive. Photographs by themselves, they're wonderful, but they won't do it. Marta brought the whole thing together.
So he got to be out in the gardens the whole time, and I got to like be like at my desk, or in the libraries. Hagley's got a wonderful library, Winterthur's got a wonderful library, but when you realize, like Henry Francis DuPont, right? He is this plantsman, and he writes to everyone. He's a prolific letter writer, and they're all in the Winterthur library. So, when I go, I'd like to see his correspondence about horticulture. Here come the boxes on the carts, It's like, oh my goodness, Anyway, it was a very fun project. Anyone else? Yes.
We have time for one more question in
Okay,
person.
sorry, and then we'll be out, we can answer more questions after. Yes.
How long did it take the collaboration? Oh, hi. How long did it take to put it all together?
Well, it took almost a year and a half, close to 2 years to get it to the editors, and then it took them another year to do the book.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think, Larry had a fairly long start on the photography, because as you said, you took a solid year and a half, 2 years.
Right.
And I think I had, 10 or 12 months, something like that, to do the research and write it. Yeah, that's all right. That's kind of typical.
When you get everything together, it takes and you turn in the text and you turn in,
Yeah.
it takes another year.
Yeah, because they have to design it.
Yeah.
Though I will say there were moments when I said, what have I done? What have I signed on to? Thank you, everyone. We'll see you outside.